In the last few videos, we've learned a bunch about the DOM and different ways that we can interact with it, with selecting elements, adding event listeners, changing things, adding new elements, and so on. So in this video, we're going to combine all that together to create a really simple to-do list application. And for this video, I'm going to have some starter code that you can use to get started with this project. It's just really basic HTML that has a div for our list, a form here, as well as a label, an input, and a button for all of our different elements to work with. And you can get all of this source code available down in the description. It's going to be linked there, and every single video like this is going to have a before and after source code linked in the description, so you can check your results with the after source code and follow along with the before source code. I also have a really simple style sheet that just allows us to have a little bit of styling for our list items themselves so that we can see that they are able to be clicked to be deleted. That's all this really does. It's really simple styles. And I have that linked up here inside of our HTML. So if we wanted to add a list item, you can see it has a class of list item. So inside of our list, we would have items such as a div with the class of list item, and this would just say wash dishes, for example. And if you see, we have that wash dishes over here. And when I highlight over that and I click on it, it'll allow us to remove it, but we don't have any of that functionality yet. That's what I want to work on. Also, when I type in here to create a new item and I click add item, I want it to actually add to the page instead of just, not show anything at all. So to get started with this, the first thing we obviously need is to create a script.js file. And inside of here, let's just link this up. So we'll say script as a source of script.js. We want to make sure this is deferred, and there we go. So this links our script tag to our index.html. Now inside of here, I kind of want to write through the steps of what we need to do in order to accomplish this task. That's the easiest way to tackle a big task like this. Also, I want to eliminate this existing list item. We want this list to be empty to start with, so there we go. So what I want to do inside here, first thing that I want to do is select all elements. There we go. Everything I need to work with, I want to do first. Then what I want to do second is I want to say, when I submit the form, add a new element. So there we go. When I click add item, I want to add a new item to the list. So for now, let's just get started with these two steps. The first thing I want to do is select all the elements we need. Well, the first thing we need is the form to do the submission. So we're going to say that is equal to document.querySelector. It has an ID here of new item form. And we can just find that inside of our index.html here. So we have our form being selected. Let's get our list itself, which is document.querySelector here. And this is going to have the ID of list. And then lastly, we need to get the actual input itself, which is just querySelector. It has an ID of item input. So now we've accomplished this first task of selecting all of our elements. That's completely done. Next thing I want to do is when I submit the form, add a new element. Well, that sounds a lot like an event listener. So we can just come down here and can say form.addEventListener on submit. And this is going to just take in an event. And inside of here, we can do a bunch of code for our event. And I just want to, by default, prevent the default because I don't want this to actually go through the page refresh. We've talked about this in previous videos, essentially just here, preventing the default so it doesn't do that page refresh. Now inside of here, let's just say console.log input.value, because I want to see what the value of our input currently is. So if we type something in here, click add item, you can see we get that value being printed down here, which is exactly what we want. So now I want to write out the steps for actually adding this new element. Let's come in here. The very first thing I want to do is create a new item. Then I want to add that item to the list. Next thing that I want to do is I want to take the value inside this input and delete it. So I can say clear input. And then finally, the very last thing that I want to do is set up event listener to delete item when clicked, just like this. So let's start with this first step of creating a new item. All we need to do inside of here is say const item is equal to document.create element, and we're just going to create a div. Then what I want to do is I want to take this item and I want to add in the text that we put inside of here. So I can say inner text. This allows me to set the actual text inside of this div. We're going to set this to our input.value. Then what I want to do is lastly, say item.classList. And I want to add a class to this list. So there's this add function we can use. And we're going to add the class list-item. So now we are essentially here having an item that we created with nothing in it. We're setting the text equal to whatever is in our input here, and we're adding the class list of list item. Let's just console.log this item out to see if so far what we've done works. So let's save, type in some gibberish, click add item, and as you can see, we have a div with the class list item, but right now it has no value. And the reason for that is it looks like I spelled value wrong here. This should say value. Now when I save, type this out, click add item, you can see we get a div, class list item, and it has the correct value inside of it. So we know that this is working. Now what we can do is move on to step number 2, add the item to the list. This is actually really easy to do. We can just say list.append child of our item. This is going to add our item to the bottom of this list element. Let's make sure this works. We'll just type in here, click add item, and it added it right here. Type something else, click add, and now it added it there, and so on. And now we're adding a bunch of items to this list. Obviously, you'll notice this input didn't get cleared though, so let's work on that next. We can just say input.value, and we just want to set the value to an empty string. This will clear out our input because it's resetting our value to an empty string. Now, when I type something in, click add item, it clears my input and adds the item up here. The last thing to do is make it so when I click on this, it removes the item from the list. That's our final step down here. And this is a little bit complicated. We want to take our item and we want to add an event listener to this whenever we click on it, because when we click on it, we want to remove it. So inside of here, what we want to do is just run a function. And inside of this function, all we're going to do is say list.remove child, and we want to remove the item from our list. Now, if we save, type something in, add it, type something else in, add it. Now, whenever we click on one of these, you'll see it removes it from the list. Another way we could have removed an item from the list is saying item.remove. This is going to do the exact same thing. It'll just remove this individual item. We can test this by just adding a few things to our list, and when we click them, they get removed. And that's all there is to this. I do want to talk a little bit though. You'll notice that up here, I used this E in here. I used a parameter inside this function, and down here, I used an empty function. The reason that I'm able to do that is because in JavaScript, when you write a function, even if you pass it more arguments than it can take, for example, here, we're passing this function an event argument, but it only takes 0 arguments. It doesn't matter. It just won't pass that along. I can kind of show you a demo of that. We can say function test, which is going to take no arguments, and it's just going to console.log test. And then I can just call test, and I can just pass it a bunch of stuff. We'll pass it a bunch of different parameters. And now what happens is when I save this, you'll notice it just logs out test, no errors are thrown. Essentially what it does is it says, I'm just going to ignore everything here because I take 0 arguments. So you can specify this to take 0 arguments. You can specify it to take 1 argument. I could even specify it to take 100 arguments, and it'll just fill in the ones that it has available for it. So if I were to come in here and say like arg1, and I print out arg1, it's just going to print out this first argument here, and it's just going to ignore everything else that comes after it. So this is really personal preference. You can just leave out this E if you're not actually using it. Here we are, which is why we put it into this params, but here we aren't using the actual event object, so we're just leaving it blank. So don't worry about that, whether it has an argument or not. That's entirely up to if you want to put it there. If I put the E here, everything is still going to work just fine. Now in the next video, I have a little bit of an exercise for you to tackle your own project where you're going to be creating a pop-up modal.